Deaf community, the pathological view and the cultural view. According to a National Center for Health Statistics estimate, 28 million Americans, almost 10% of the population, have a hearing loss of some degree. Of these 28 million people, 2 million are classified as deaf. This was stated by Gabrielle Grayson in her book, Talking with Your Hands, Listening with Your Eyes. There was a point in history when deaf people were not allowed to vote or own property. It was by Plato's assumption that those who couldn't speak showed no intelligence. Plato concluded deaf people must not be capable of ideas or language. It was also concluded by Aristotle those who could not speak were unteachable. In an article, Deaf Culture, Changes and Challenges, however, Paul Bacon stated overcoming these challenges and striving to gain acceptance in the hearing world while embracing the isolation of the living in a world without sound have all helped to define the deaf as a group with a distinct culture. Plato and Aristotle were overlooking the idea that speech isn't the only means of communication. Bacon was then able to see these struggles as part of the deaf community's history and part of what made them the distinct culture they are today. What is the deaf community? The deaf community is a group of individuals who share a common language, American Sign Language. They also share a common set of beliefs and rituals. As the awareness of the deaf community becomes stronger, so do two distinct views of this community. First, the cultural view of the community is one many deaf individuals have, a view that incorporates the idea that deaf people are not impaired. Second, the pathological view of the deaf community is a view many medical professionals hold. This view defines being deaf as a disability. Members of the deaf community want people who are not part of the community to respect their language and culture. They prefer the terms deaf, hard of hearing, or deafened when someone is referring to someone with a hearing loss. When someone considers themselves part of the deaf community, they consider themselves members of a group that includes all deaf people. The community doesn't have the sense of individualism that most dominant cultures in the United States have. Deaf people often pay more attention to physical appearance rather than names to remember someone. Often in conversation, the name of an individual won't come up until the end of the conversation. Generally, a conversation starts with where the other individual is from and discussing the friends they have in common. It was stated on PEP.net, most hearing people do not freely and effectively use their face and body to communicate. So deaf people see their communication as lifeless and lacking emotion. Not only is our conversation different in face and body motions, but also eye contact. The pathological perspective can also be thought of as the medical perspective. This perspective has preconceived notions that being deaf is a disability and uses terms like hearing impaired, deaf mute, and profoundly deaf. These terms often offend the deaf community. This is because these terms suggest that deaf individuals are broken or inferior. The history of the deaf people and their culture begins in 400 BC, when deaf people had no rights. This idea lasted until the Renaissance, when new ideas for teaching deaf individuals were discovered. During the 1700s, Charles Abbé de Lep opened the first school for deaf individuals in France. Although Lep was able to learn sign, he was unable to recognize that sign was its own complete language. In the article, Watching Films, Learning Language, Experiencing Culture, an account of the deaf culture through history and popular films, Avan stated, what Lep failed to recognize, however, was the completeness of sign language. Sheehan and Stewart contend that while Lep is revered by many for creating and calling attention to the deaf community, Lep could only learn sign because of its pre-existence. Therefore, his contributions were not so much a formation of a community as an expansion for which he may have even served as an ambassador in some ways. After Lep raised the awareness of the deaf community, the ideals grew for a long period of time. It wasn't until 1815 that Americans began teaching the deaf, and it wasn't until 1817 a school was opened. The first school was opened by Lauren Clare in Hartford, Connecticut. Because of American Sign Language history, 2/3 of the words in sign have a French origin. In 1864, the first university for deaf individuals, Gallaudet, was opened. Since the opening of this university, Gallaudet students and faculty have rallied and gotten a deaf president, King Jordan, elected. King Jordan was elected president over 2 other hearing candidates, showing the deaf people were no longer limited by a hearing society.
I just recently went to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. It was such a wonderful experience. I went to classes, actually took plenty of those, but I learned the most from socializing with deaf people there. We'd go to museums, and we would also go to restaurants. For example, there was this man from Ethiopia, a country in Africa, and we went to an Ethiopian restaurant, and he'd order food using Ethiopian Sign Language, and that was so interesting.
American Sign Language is now recognized as a language of a linguistic minority. Around 500,000 North Americans use ASL as their natural and primary source of communication.
I hopped off the plane at LAX with a dream, my cardigan. Welcome to the land of fame excess. Am I gonna fit in? Jumped in the cab, here I am for the first time. Look to my right and I see the Hollywood sign. This is all so crazy. Everybody seems so famous. My tummy's turning and I'm feeling kinda homesick. Too much pressure and I'm nervous. That's when the taxi man turned on the radio and a Jay-Z song was on. And the Jay-Z song was on. And the Jay-Z song was on. So I put my hands up to play my song. The butterflies fly away. Nodding in my head like yeah. Moving my hips like yeah. I got my hands up to play my song. You know I'm gonna be okay. Yeah. It's a party in the USA.
Robert Sparrow stated, "Cochlear implants are a technology which attempts to cure deafness by bypassing the outer ear through electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve." As our society searches for a cure to deafness, the deaf community believes there is no need to find a cure, that nothing is wrong with being deaf. What makes deafness a disability? Before making this predetermined judgment, we should know most deaf people do not feel that deafness is a disability. Sparrow also stated a sizable proportion of deaf individuals say that they would not want to be granted hearing, even if it were possible. Deaf people often make up for their inability to hear with stronger senses in other areas. It could even be thought that in a certain environment, being deaf could be an advantage. The deaf community has the ability to be strong and normal as any. Sparrow stated, "Cochlear implant technology represents an attack on the culture of the deaf because it seeks to ensure that deaf children grow up to use a spoken language rather than the sign language of the deaf. Many Americans don't view being deaf as simply being different. The idea is that something is wrong with being deaf. Although many people believe that being deaf is a cultural identity, therefore they believe cochlear implants are unnecessary and potentially harmful." My purpose in this paper was to defend the belief that the deaf community does exist. I chose to examine the 2 views that exist about the deaf community, the pathological view and the cultural view. Also to discuss the long history of the deaf community and how it got to where it is today. The history of the deaf community began around 400 BC. This history, as long and specific as it is, has shown the great unity of the deaf community. I believe the deaf community has overcome enough experiences to prove themselves as a community. I also think looking at ideas that oppose the idea that the deaf community is its own community, that the deaf should be able to choose whether they want to be involved in such a community. It isn't fair to these people to force oralism or cochlear implants on them just because our society believes something is wrong with them. As stated above, 90% of deaf individuals would not want to be granted hearing even if it were possible.